Are we on? I think we're on. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are here for part 2 of our Nigeria lecture. So let's get right back into what we're talking about. So I need to see if I can get this to play. All right. Local government. Oops, sorry about the typo there. We are now going to talk about the local government, otherwise known as this issue of disintegrative federalism, and what has been going on in Nigeria with its states, how things have been changing, and a couple of really important dynamics that we're going to look at in here. There are sort of 3 key issues when we look at the states that are going to come up today and in other classes. And one of those is the Sharia law, which is in the north. And then there's the question of the ungovernable delta, which is in the southeast. And then we have the issue of Abuja, the capital, losing its control, literally, over the states to kind of a sense of the godfathers or the warlordism or whatever you want to call it. Let's look at the growth of states in Nigeria. Nigeria has started its nationhood with only 3 states, and now they're at 36. And people have asked the question, as it has fallen into more and more states, is this a sense of using the old divide and conquer techniques of the British and of other colonialists to make it easier to control Nigeria? Or is this really meant to be a fair way to give more representation to more and more different ethnic groups? That's what we're going to try to look at and address to some degree. We're going to do a little journey through the maps, the growths of the states. It's kind of incredible when you see the first 3 regions in the early Nigeria. There's massive north, and then a little west and a little east. And the next improvement was not much of an improvement. It was simply to divide the south even further, right? And so the north had easy control in the legislature, and even in elections, it seemed to be the case. After 67, we're going to see our first kind of big breakup into 12 states. And again, the excuse was this is going to give more representation to more groups. So it's not just 3 ethnic groups, but we're going to be allowing different groups to have more representation. We go from 12 to 19, and then the 19 are going to hold for quite a while. And then we're going to break it down even further. Actually in 87 and all the way through 91, there's going to be 30 states. And you can see them getting smaller and smaller and more specific names in more of the local regional languages. And then finally, we go to 36 states. And that's where we are today. If you break up each of these states, you also get the local units, of which we have more than 800 local units. Biggest issue when we talk about local government, states, or even more regional than that, is this idea of the derivation formula. Where does the money come from? The federal government controls what they call the purse strings. The money comes from Abuja. There isn't, state taxes being collected. It's very different from what we're used to here in the American system. In fact, it's so specific to the degree that the federal government in Abuja is simply deciding specifically how much goes to each governor. And there's something of a mystery behind the system, but we've got 2 numbers out there. 13% of the oil wealth is supposed to go to the governor, specifically to the governor to use for his state. 86% of all revenue comes from oil. Okay? So there is an enormous amount of money coming from oil. There's no accountability to the system. And I think I left something out. That 13%, that's the amount that's supposed to go to the Niger Delta states, and then all the rest is supposed to be shared amongst all the other states. But what happens in reality is that the federal government writes a check to the governor to his name, and then he gets that every month and then gets to use it. And there's very little accountability once it goes to the governor. So the governor has an enormous amount of power, but is totally dependent on the checks coming in from the capital. Finally, in your notes, the military. This is the only truly meritocratic system within the government. There is not as much corruption within the military as there in all the other branches of government and bureaucracy in Nigeria. That truly the ones who have the most education and training and good performance can rise in the ranks in the government, with the exception of some changes that happened during military coups. It does tend to attract really a best and brightest group of Nigeria within the officer corps. A lot of northern Muslims have made their way through the military. And the military loves politics. There have been, most recently, 4 generals were running in the election. 4 former generals, of course. They all retired and were no longer generals. And also, before we get into public policy, the last thing in this section of your notes is the political culture and ideology section. And we'll get more into this when we look at elections and competition and things like that. But I will stress now that there is not an ideological divide. There's not a left and a right or a communist and a capitalist. The parties are, like in Russia, parties of power. And Nigerians tend to be very involved in politics, high degree of voter turnout. As I mentioned, they tend to love to discuss politics and to debate politics. Nigerians are very proud of being Nigerian. However, the internal divisions are also very powerful and profound. And this is where you get to in your notes the section that has the salaries list. And it's really incredible to look this one over. So give yourself a second to look through. You got your basic salary. This is in Naira, right? And it's about, I think, like 140 Naira to the dollar. So they're getting 2.5 million Naira as their salary, basic salary. And then you add to that this hardship allowance, which is half of what you make because it's a hardship to be in Congress, right? And then you get this constituency allowance, money to spend on people who voted for you, I guess, 2 times your salary. Your furniture allowance, which is 3 times your salary, so that you can pay for all the furniture that you must need. Newspaper allowance, just to buy newspapers to keep up with the news. You get half your salary. My goodness. Skipping down a little bit, you can read these on your own, but things like the vehicle, motor vehicle allowance, 400% of your salary. The severance gratuity, 300% of your salary to make up for the fact that you're going to get fired at some point. These all add up to making this enormous, incredible salary and the high-stakes game that becomes Nigerian politics. The other list I added in here before we move on is the Nigerian tax code, and just to show you how complex and complicated it is. Nigeria is rated as one of the hardest places in the world for foreigners to do business, and there's all these taxes that make it complicated and confusing, and people don't want to pay their taxes because they don't feel like it goes anywhere, and so you pay a bribe instead of taxes, and it's this huge, catastrophic, confusing system. But let's talk public policy now, all right? And what is true in Nigeria will be true in most of the global south or third world or developing world, and in Nigeria, as I said, and that is that the major focus of public policy, the 2 biggest priorities in like 95% of the countries that we're going to see in this category of countries are going to be, of course, the security imperative and economic development. Security imperative is the money and the concern that you spend just to keep you and your government in power. And then economic development, of course, is how do you take your people out of poverty and try to attempt to have your economy grow and improve the lives of people. And you need to do this quickly because, of course, there's a great demand. This is what makes people happy or frustrated if you're not doing it and you're playing this game of catch up. But you might be out of funds because you're so busy on that first one, that security imperative, trying to keep yourself from being overthrown. Depends on how much legitimacy you have, right? So, DEMOCRAZY. This was an expression that comes from Paul Collier of the Bottom Billion. I kind of like it. So let's look at that security imperative, right? You're in fear of your coup d'etat, military takeover. Are we in a democracy or is it just plain DEMOCRAZY? Country like Nigeria has actually come to use the coup as a policy plan, you could say. In other words, if governments don't stay in line, then they can expect to be removed by the army. The army's done it so many times that it's like second hand, right? It's a habit. Is this a reasonable policy? Instead of just being judgmental and laughing at Nigeria and other countries that do this, are there some benefits? What are the pros and cons? And we'll start with some pros, right? There are some, I guess there's nothing there. There are some really important pros. It can be an effective deterrent. And there are some success stories, right? In Senegal in 2000, the president, it was before Abdoulaye Wade, it was Abdou Diouf. You don't need to know these names, but he did not want to give up power, even though he lost the election to Abdoulaye Wade. And the military essentially came in and said, you better accept defeat or we will take over. And so he accepted defeat and they didn't have to take over. But Senegal had a long history of the military being effective, right? So that brings us to the con, the negative side, that military dictatorships and threats of coups is a dangerous habit to get into. And the problem that coups tend to lead to more coups and more coups. He who lives by the gun dies by the gun, as I said the other day. And the very fact that a lot of times when the military takes over, they start to like being in power and they don't want to give up this newfound power, right? So one of the most important protective measures that an analysis of different countries with coups has found is that term limits. Countries with presidential term limits have had fewer coups because you can just wait until the next election as long as there's something resembling a free and fair election. I don't know why I have import, substitution, and dependency theory in here. This is the wrong slide. We want to get to structural adjustment, right? We will talk more about development when we're together, but I want to talk about structural adjustment, neoliberalism, and the international financial institutions. The structural adjustment programs, or the SAPs, are these famous plans that begin in Africa in the 80s and 90s and become huge, right? And they're very specific. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the international lenders would tell the African countries that if you want to get more money, and of course they needed desperately to get more money because they were bankrupt, then you need to follow these rules that we're going to lay out. And these were known as the neoliberal approach. The first one was you need to privatize your state-owned enterprises. Everything owned by the government should be sold to the private market. You need to end subsidies, like subsidies to farmers and subsidies to gasoline, to make that cheaper. It's odd that a country like the United States was telling countries that they needed to do this to have economic growth because we are very dependent on our own subsidies. There was also the idea of reducing tariffs. Again, slightly ironic that it comes from an American-based proposal. It's the international institutions, but this was something we strongly supported in the 80s. We grew our nation's industries on raising our tariffs, if you remember from AP US history, but we're telling them to cut their tariffs, and then we're telling them that they must shrink the size of the state, lay off a lot of government jobs, have fewer government services, make your government and your state smaller, and finally encourage foreign direct investment, more foreign investment. And essentially they're saying to these countries that you should just be shipping out raw materials. We shouldn't bother with producing goods in your countries because you don't have the comparative advantage. This was known as a total liberalization of the markets. Oh, I forgot one. Floating the currency. Nigeria had a fixed currency. It was 22 naira to $1. They said, no, you got to let that go. You got to float that. You can't keep that, right? So I'm going to move on. That was not just Nigeria, that list I just gave you. That was for every country that had to go through structural adjustment, which was most of Africa and then most of the developing world. And these were the only ways you could get the loans that you desperately needed for your government to stay afloat. If we look at the Nigerian specific examples, there's a few other things that they were told they had to do. Decrease their dependency on oil. All right, they were around 90%, now it's around 80%. Oops, not so successful, right? They were told to privatize, get rid of everything that the state owned. Now, the reality of that one, we'll see, is going to be more or less that you sell the ones that you don't mind selling because they're not making much money. But does the government really want to sell industries that are incredibly successful? Probably not. Reducing government spending. This meant cut social programs. Education, healthcare, all the things that help the masses. This is not going to be popular. I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine why they thought this would be. Float the currencies. You've got to let that naira. This goes back to the stories of when I was there and all the difficulties in trading your money because it was this fixed rate that was artificially low and it just was disastrous for the economy. What's the result of all this? What's going to happen? Total catastrophic failure, failure, failure. Massive unemployment results because people are losing their jobs and there's an economic crisis, major inflation, the prices of everything skyrocket, right? And this leads to a monumental increase in income inequality. The people at the top with government connections make the right decisions because they know what's happening and they become unbelievably wealthy in various ways. And then the poor become poorer and poorer. And of course, it's going to lead to political instability. And the reality in the end of several decades of structural adjustment is that the state still owns most of the economy. This whole thing was predicated on an idea that a smaller state was somehow going to lead to a more vibrant set of markets and a more vibrant society, and it's not what happened. The reality was much more depressing, right? And you had instability, political instability, violence, chaos. You had political violence in particular, right? Because the importance of the elections and the votes became everything or all nothing. Poverty, increases in poverty. This was just a big mess. And it says in your notes, the idea that calls for the subjugation of political and social life to a set of processes termed market forces, that's the official definition of neoliberalism. But you could also say it was the idea of following all of the various policies that we just laid out, right? And of course, I forgot on there, corruption continues to be a reality and a major problem that keeps anything from like this structural adjustment from working. And of course, the idea or the reminder that when you combine total free market economy, right, try to get the state out of the economy altogether, which, by the way, is not how our economy grew to being the #1 in the world, and then you combine that with total democracy, allowing everybody to vote and giving this total freedom, which in general we're in support of that. But when you combine that with free market economy, you have something that none of the developed world tried to do all at once, right? Remember how we gradually allowed people to vote and we gradually moved towards more and more free economy. It's catastrophic in so many countries, and Nigeria just being one example. Although tomorrow or the next day we'll learn more about elections and how they go from being pretty good to terrible to even worse to maybe not so bad and starting to be good again. Well, we'll see. We'll find out. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye.